Welcome to Born to Win. I am Brian Proctor, and I've created these podcast episodes around timeless principles that I learned from my father, Bob Proctor. And when understood and applied, these principles can change the direction of your life. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please like, follow, comment, and share. It helps this message reach more people who are ready for it. Today we're going to talk about an expression that is often misunderstood, and that phrase is act as if. But before we get into today's topic, I have a quick announcement. This episode is being released on Monday, July 27th. And after today, I'll be taking a short pause from the podcast while my team and I prepare for our live event in Toronto at the end of August. This event, it's especially meaningful for a lot of reasons. We'll spend 4 days together diving deeply into these principles. And on the final day, we'll gather inside my father, Bob Proctor's studio in Toronto. For me, that's more than a location. It's a place where so many of the ideas that we've been discussing on this podcast were studied, tested, refined, and shared with the world. If you'd like more information about the event, you'll find a link in the show notes, or you can visit brianproctor.com. We'll resume the Born to Win podcast on Monday, September 7th. Until then, I want to leave you with one thought. Use this break to go back and re-listen to the previous episodes. Don't simply consume these ideas. Practice them. Think about them and apply them. My father often reminded us that repetition is the secret to transformation. It's not hearing an idea once that changes your life. It's returning to it again and again and again, until you begin building a new path and it becomes part of the way you think. Now, let's come back to today's topic. Act as if. This is one of those phrases that I think is often misunderstood. Sometimes when people hear it, they assume it means being dishonest or pretending. Pretending you're successful, pretending you're confident, pretending everything is okay when it isn't. That isn't what my father meant. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Because pretending, that's exhausting. When you're pretending, you're constantly trying to convince other people of something you haven't yet accepted yourself. That's not transformation. That's performance. And eventually, every performance comes to an end. Act as if is not about becoming someone you're not. It's about behaving in harmony with a person you're becoming. There's a profound difference. One of my favorite stories about my father comes from when he was a young boy. He told it many times over the years because it left a lasting impression on him. There was a gentleman who lived in his neighborhood who, because of a health condition, had not gone off to war with the other men. While many people might have focused on that, what captured my father's attention had nothing to do with the man's circumstances. It was the way he carried himself. Every day, Bob would see him walking through the neighborhood for exercise. His head was up, his shoulders were back, his eyes were looking straight ahead. He walked with purpose. There was a confidence about him, a quiet certainty. He wasn't rushing anywhere, but every step had intention. As a young boy, my father found himself fascinated by that. He thought, that's how I want to walk. Now think about that for a moment. He didn't wait until he felt confident before he walked that way. He began walking that way first. At first, it felt awkward. It wasn't who he believed himself to be yet. But he kept doing it, day after day, until eventually it became natural. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, that is exactly who my father became. People often talked about his presence. They would say they could almost feel him enter a room before they ever saw him. It wasn't because he was trying to impress anyone. It wasn't an act, and it wasn't a performance. It was simply the natural expression of the person that he had spent years becoming. I think that's one of the clearest examples of what act as if really means. He wasn't pretending to be confident. He was practicing confidence. There's a tremendous difference. Every time he chose to lift his head, every time he chose to stand a little taller, every time he chose to walk with purpose, he was reinforcing a new self-image. Eventually, that way of carrying himself wasn't something he did. It became who he was. And that's how transformation works. Not one dramatic moment, but through hundreds and thousands of seemingly ordinary repetitions that gradually shape an extraordinary life. Now consider this. Your current results are the product of the person you've been. If you want different results, you must begin thinking, choosing, and behaving differently before those results arrive. At first, it may feel uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because you're stepping outside of old habits and beginning to build new habits. And every new habit, every new decision to adopt a new habit will require you to use your higher mental faculties. And every time you choose growth instead of comfort, you're casting another vote for the person you're becoming. And when you do this consistently, something remarkable begins to happen. When you act as if, your behavior starts changing first. Then your thinking begins to change. And through repetition, your belief grows stronger. Eventually, you reach a point where you no longer feel like you're acting as if. You simply become that person. That is transformation. And that's what my father meant when he said, act as if. So how can you begin using this powerful exercise to make decisions from the future instead of reacting to an outdated self-image? First, accept the idea. One of the greatest misunderstandings in personal development is the idea of fake it until you make it. And that phrase is often confused with act as if. I've never liked the phrase fake it till you make it. Faking suggests deception. Acting as if requires integrity. One asks you to fool other people. The other asks you to become a different person. One of the biggest shifts people must make is understanding that success is an identity before it becomes a result. You must be the person before success shows up. That's difficult for many people because we're taught to let results determine identity. I'll be confident once I succeed, or I'll feel worthy once I lose the weight, or I'll become disciplined once life settles down. Do you see how that is the opposite? Identity actually comes first. Behavior follows. Results eventually catch up. It is your self-image that governs almost everything, because it influences your behavior based on the potential you have limited yourself to inside that self-image. And it is always behavior that determines results. You don't consistently act outside the image you hold of yourself. This is why consciously choosing to act as if is such a powerful exercise, because real transformation, it begins inside. Think about someone training to become a firefighter. The first day they walk into the academy, they don't yet possess all the skills they'll eventually have. But from day one, they're expected to think differently, to carry themselves differently, to develop judgment, to operate under pressure. They're not pretending to be firefighters. They're growing into that identity. Every drill, every lesson, every repetition is helping them become someone capable of doing the job. Every action you repeatedly take sends a message back to your subconscious mind about who you believe you are. This is how transformation in life works. One thing I observed repeatedly growing up around my father was that he never separated thinking from behavior. People often asked him, "What should I do?" He almost always redirected them toward a different question. Who do you need to become? That's a much more powerful question because behavior naturally follows identity. Let's say someone tells me they want to become financially independent. Wonderful. Now the question becomes, how would a financially independent person think about money? How would they make decisions? How would they respond to setbacks? Would they constantly complain, or would they look for opportunity? Would they spend impulsively or invest intentionally? Notice, we're no longer talking about money. We're talking about identity. Now here's another example. Imagine you decided you want to write a book. Many people wait until they feel like an author. Authors don't become authors because they feel inspired every day. They become authors because they do the work. They write, even on days they don't feel like it. They don't wait for identity. They build it, page by page and word by word. Researchers studying identity-based habits have found something fascinating. Long-term change is far more likely when behavior becomes connected to identity. Instead of asking, "What do I need to do?" begin asking, "What would the person I aspire to be do?" That subtle shift changes everything. You're no longer forcing behavior. You're expressing identity. My father was teaching that decades before it became popular in behavioral science. One of my favorite examples comes from aviation. Before a pilot ever flies a commercial aircraft full of passengers, they spend countless hours in flight simulators. And the simulator isn't pretending. It's preparation. It's repetition. It's identity formation. The pilot is learning to think clearly under pressure long before real lives depend upon those decisions. When they finally sit in the cockpit, they're not hoping they'll know what to do. They've already become the kind of person who does. That is act as if. This is where your higher mental faculties of imagination and will begin working together again. Imagination allows you to see the future version of yourself. Will allows you to keep making decisions consistent with that image, day after day, even before external evidence appears. Nourish the habits of the person you're becoming before the harvest arrives. Now, I want to make something very clear. Acting as if does not mean buying things you can't afford. It doesn't mean pretending your problems don't exist. It doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means choosing your response based on where you're going, rather than where you've been. Those are two completely different things. It is about choosing how you want to show up and then stepping into that identity. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you are. That's why your habits matter so much. Habits are simple, visible expressions of your self-image. Change the self-image, and over time the habits begin to change. Change the habits, and eventually the results begin to change. So think about it. What you are is revealed every day in your choices, your standards, your conversations, your attitude, the way you respond when no one is watching. Here's something worth asking yourself. If the future version of you walked into the room today, would they make the same decisions you're making right now? Would they spend their evenings the same way? Would they have the same conversations? Would they complain about the same things? Or would they quietly choose differently? That's not criticism, it's awareness. One thing I've noticed is that many people want extraordinary lives while protecting ordinary habits. Those two things, they rarely coexist. Growth almost always requires letting go of behaviors that belong to the previous version of yourself. That's uncomfortable, but discomfort is often evidence that transformation is underway. My father taught me something years ago that has really stayed with me. He said, don't ask yourself whether you can afford your dream. Ask yourself whether you can afford not to become the person capable of living it. I've never forgotten that, because becoming is always the greater reward. Let's connect this back to the question we've explored in recent episodes. What do you really want? Once you know the answer, the next question naturally becomes, who must I become? Because those two questions always belong together. Goals without becoming aren't really a thing because a goal is there to make you grow. So how do you begin? You begin by asking one simple question before making decisions throughout the day. What would the future version of me choose? Not next year, today. At breakfast, at work, when you're tired, when you're discouraged, when you're tempted to quit. Every decision becomes another vote for the person you're becoming. So this week's Born to Win practice is simple. Choose one meaningful goal. Now, write this question underneath it. Who must I become to achieve this? Don't write actions, write qualities. Qualities like patience, discipline, curiosity, confident, generous, focused. Then choose just one of those qualities. Practice expressing it deliberately every day this week, because that is who you are choosing to become. You know, people often believe success changes a person. Sometimes it does, but more often, the person changes first. Then success becomes possible. That's why act as if is not an invitation to pretend, but rather an invitation to grow beyond where you currently are. One decision, one habit, one thought, one standard at a time, until one day you realize you're no longer acting as if. You're simply being the person you decided to become. And that is when you truly begin living like someone who was born to win. Thank you for joining me today on Born to Win. If this message resonated with you, please share it with someone who could use a reminder of their own inner greatness. It also helps me to reach more people if you rate and follow this podcast. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Brian Proctor Official. And remember, success isn't about luck or timing. It's about alignment. You were designed for success, built for expansion, and born to win. I'll be back with a new episode on Monday, September 7th. Until then, think big, trust yourself, and keep growing.